Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell. Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is John Langellier, and I'm watching the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
I love when things come together, John. I'm driving, and I've been trying for weeks to get something sorted out to talk about Southwest Arizona history. And, you know, I've talked to Fort Huachuca, and they've got their thing. By the way, thanks to Angie for setting this all up. And, you know, I worked, and COVID canceled somebody at the last minute. I'm like, oh, my God, what am I going to do yesterday? You know, I'm trying to get all this stuff set up. And she mentions in passing that you're like an expert on Buffalo Soldiers, which is fascinating to me as a guy that went to a post that had Buffalo Soldiers on it, has a gate named after the Buffalo Soldier, has a statue. And so I wanted to talk about Southeast history. And so I'm driving down the road. I call some random number, and then you happen to call me, 2 exits before your house? And you're like, come on over. And I love that. So thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for all the work that you've done. You guys can't believe how many great books this guy's written about the Southwest in general. And as soon as I shut up, he'll start talking, and I'm not going to have a chance to say anything because he knows so much about everything. But before we go too much further, I'm fascinated by the whole critical race theory topic and how we deal with ethnicity and race in our history and trying to tell these stories in a way that makes sense. You know, we can't be surprised about the history we don't bother to study. That's one of my critiques. But how do we deal with this? And when you look at Southeast Arizona, I mean, you have, first off, simultaneously, you have Tombstone and all its craziness, which is political, and it's bandits, and it's cowboys, and it's, you know, miners, and all these things, plus the Apache Wars, plus Buffalo Soldiers, all these different people. There's Chinese people here. There's all the different ethnic groups that come from Mexico and the indigenous side. How do we make sense of the importance of race and ethnicity in history? Are we doing it right? Can we do a better job? How is it in South Arizona?
You know, your last portion of the question is the operative one. Are we doing it right? I don't think we've ever done it right. Let's face it, no matter what generation you're from, we know what we think we know, mainly from, today from some sort of online, Facebook, whatever. But in my era, it was motion picture and early television. And that was the portrayal we got. It was John Wayne and, you know, and Randolph Scott, and you took your hat off and bowed your head when you said Randolph Scott. And that was our perspective on the West. Once in a while, there'd be a token role for the Chinese cook on, you know, on Have Gun Will Travel or on, you know, the Bonanza. There would be sometimes a black, usually, once again, he's the cook on the cattle drive, if you even see that, Mr. Nightlinger in the Cowboys, which is probably one of the great roles. But obviously, African Americans were somewhat latecomers to the American West, but not so much so because they arrived with the Spanish expeditions under Coronado and others. There's so-called Esteban, you know, who comes out west. He's enslaved, and as most blacks will be in all the cultures. Ultimately, blacks will separate in various cultures until finally we get the message over the worst conflict that we've ever had, the Second American Revolution, sometimes known as the Civil War. That Civil War will have one positive aspect to it, and that is the beginning to deal with the fact that there are others besides white males who are the only people who should vote or run the country. As we know, ironically, women won't get the vote until well into the 20th century. The last people to get the vote are the first people here. The first here get to be the last, and that's the Native Americans or the American Indian people. The First Nations, as Canada refers to the indigenous peoples. All those people live here at various and sundry times, and they all will start coming together roughly during the time of the American Civil War and post-Civil War here in Arizona. And you're sitting in a part of Arizona that was still part of Mexico in the 1850s. Right. It's not purchased. We didn't rip it off as we did other things, you know, one by conquest. But it is something that we purchased because of the railroad, again, entrepreneurial. And all those things that become Arizona have their roots with either the Spanish-speaking people who introduced cattle and horses to this area and start the ranches and start mining and this sort of thing. The native peoples are essentially pushed aside or have to accommodate. They're so diverse amongst themselves. There's no such thing as an Indian any more than there really is an African or there really is a European. They happen to live in a geographic area. And so these people have different belief systems. They speak different languages. They have traditional enemies. They have sometimes traditional allies. And sometimes, just like in any other culture, they switch depending on opportunities. The word Apache isn't the word that the people themselves use. That's a word from another tribal group that means enemy. Apaches are the Inde. Their cousins, the other Athabascan-speaking people, are the Dine. We know them as the Navajo. And the Navajo at one time, we think of them as this incredibly diverse people who do silversmithing and weaving and all that. That all comes in after they make contact with the Spanish, who they raid. They're horsemen. Their raiders are as fierce as their Apache cousins. But ultimately, after the 1860s, begin to say it's time to accommodate. Now they're the largest group of native peoples in the United States. Essentially, they have a vast reservation and they have great numbers. And finally, their culture has been given back. The irony, as we know, is we're sending you away. We're trying to take the Indian out of the Indian and make you white. So we send you to Carlisle and other schools to become a farmer, no longer speak your language, punish, cut your hair, etc. Yeah. And then World War II wraps around. And who are the heroes that people now think of? The Navajo code talkers. The very same people who are being punished to speak their language help prosecute World War II in the Pacific specifically. So Arizona is never a melting pot. It's always a mosaic. And in many respects, the Army in Arizona has reflected that, particularly since the 1880s, when you have immigrants from Europe, white officers who are West Pointers or Civil War veterans who are oftentimes from fairly affluent or at least middle-class families, somewhat better educated. Their wives who leave some of the most fascinating tales about Arizona. One book, if your readers never read another thing, it's called Vanished Arizona by Martha Summerhays from Massachusetts. And her thought, to paraphrase, was anything west of Boston was the end of the world until she got out here and hated it, and then came back 10 years after she had been here the first time and hated the fact that it had changed. It was no longer the Wild West, the rugged frontier that she had known, where the women smoked cigarettes and wore loose dresses and no bustles, and her Indian manservant was semi-naked and appealed to her aesthetic interests. We would probably say prurient interests, but she said aesthetic interests. And so this complex society exists side by side, sometimes together, oftentimes apart. And so those stories have been essentially lost, and those are the very stories that help us understand how do we accommodate each other and yet keep our own identity.
Yeah, there's a lot in that, and I've been fascinated recently by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and she's growing up concurrently in this same kind of time frame, and you realize just how close to the edge of survival her family is. They live in a dugout, on the bank of a river for a while. Locusts come and wipe out crops for the entire community. So all of these things are going on. And then there's modern critique of her work because of her view and expression of Indians. But these were mosaics. And sometimes you are working cross purposes. Sometimes you are stealing land and people don't like that. Or there's a vendetta that you are paying because you show up next, or whatever it is. And the amount of massacres. There's another guy I had on the show recently, and he does the Texas kind of version of this. And I'm like, every book you write is like bloody this, battle that. And it was a lot of fighting. So as we look at this, and one of the things that fascinates me is, when do you belong to a place? I mean, we talk about First Nation people, Native Americans, Indigenous Americans, whatever it is. At some point, you're indigenous. Maybe I'm not. I would consider myself indigenous, but maybe I'm not. I've got to belong to somewhere. If I go to the Caucasus region, they're not going to be like, you're indigenous to here, welcome back. They're going to say, you don't belong here. So at some point, you belong to some place. And then we know that the Apache, the Cheyenne, all of the different tribes, they didn't all just hang out and agree like, this is their spot, this is my spot. They fought. And so, yeah, maybe right now we're on Navajo land or whatever it's going to be, but who was there before? So how do you, as a historian, how do you sort that? Do you just go back to a certain point and go, I don't know anymore? Because a lot of that history has to just be gone, right? Because there's, other than archaeological digs and maybe some anthropological stuff to understand how they did it, it'd be hard to know who lived here 500 years before the people who lived here 100 years ago.
Precisely. The oral traditions are passed down, but they're all filtered just like today's news is on one channel versus another channel, depending on your political point of view or what have you. And as a consequence, even the archaeologists who do marvelous work, they're still going to put a spin on it. Thank you, Bill O'Reilly. that because they have their own cultural background and bias. And a colleague of mine, Frank Mickey Schubert, who is literally, in my estimation, the dean of so-called Buffalo soldiers. There's no such thing really as a Buffalo soldier, but it's an easy shorthand that we somewhat understand today, says that, that you, first of all, when you look at history changes over time. So you're not looking at a snapshot from a Polaroid from the 1960s. It's not frozen. And secondly, you can't look back through time through your own lenses and your own filters. That you can try and make sense out of it, but you can't judge, for instance, certain people by what they did then. Doesn't make it right, but somebody can do the same thing to us in 100 years from now and say, how did you do this and why? And so many of those stories are lost. But to your point, these people were diverse people with various backgrounds. And so even before the Spanish arrive, even before the United States acquires this area and other areas through treaty, through conquest, through whatever, you end up having people who are fighting for very limited resources. Now, yes, Arizona has changed. We have had, real climate change. It comes and goes. But there are people who farm, such as the Toda Odam, who are the people who got to be known as the Papago, who are done at the San Javier, most exquisite mission virtually in the United States, on the same grounds, at least a mission since the 17th century, under an Italian by the name of Aquino, a Jesuit. Finally, one of his guys got to be Pope. He waited long enough, I guess. And having said that, you have these cultures fighting each other for these confined resources, and then you add new layers of the Spanish who come to exploit resources. They also bring a new religion, which they're going to essentially say, we have to burn the village to save it. We have to convert you. We may have to kill you, but if we can convert you, it's all right. So everybody has a perspective that in some cases begins to accommodate. So you get somebody like the famous Cochise. Mm-hmm. Cochise is a fierce battle leader, but a wise diplomat, and sees the handwriting on the wall and says, how can we keep who we are through strength, but give in enough to maintain and let these guys come through with their stagecoaches or their mail deliveries or whatever, and retain that. You get another side of the story, and you get a Geronimo who's not willing to accommodate. And one of the longest wars in our nation takes place because of he and others of like. Now, to some, he's a freedom fighter. To others, even with his own group, he's a malcontent. He's a guy who's raising problems, and he's causing me to suffer with my family every time he goes out. And to give you the more complex, yes, it's one thing to have something like Little Bighorn, where the Cheyenne, the Lakota, the Sioux, others, they've pushed out from Minnesota, and they're on the Great Plains because they now have horses and firearms, which they never had before the arrival of the Spanish. So they're pushing other groups like the Crow and others further west. So this is push even without us, although we certainly help influence it and exaggerate it. But there are within those groups people who are willing to serve against their own people. Why would you of a certain ethnicity agree to be a cop in the hood? Well, because you want your neighborhood, where your parents are, where your family and friends are, to be as safe as any other neighborhood. And so we'll have a fellow like a West Point graduate that we were talking about before the show started running, by the name of Powhatan Clarke. And Clarke is a cracker from Louisiana. And his dad's a Confederate officer during the Civil War. And he goes to West Point as part of everybody's going to have to get back together and can't we just get along situation. Graduates dead last in his class, comes out here first to Texas, to Fort Davis. And one of his first missions he sent out with this guy named Quanah Parker. Uh-huh. And Quanah Parker is the ultimate leader in many respects of the Comanche people, to use the term we would use in our society, who has now agreed to accommodate and come onto the reservation, but because of religious reasons is going out to get peyote, because it's part of the tradition of the Comanches and other tribal groups. So they send this green lieutenant out with black soldiers to look for peyote. And while they're out there, they come across a trail that was left a few days earlier and it was the Apaches, because there are Apaches of a different group in Eastern Apaches in Texas. And Quanah essentially says, to paraphrase to this young green lieutenant, who he calls the baby chief, too bad we didn't get here sooner. We could have had a hell of a fight. In other words, these Comanches would have been ready to take these Apaches on because they're not us. And most of the names for these people mean the people, Right. So if you ever watch Little Big Man, it's we're the human beings or the people, and ergo, the rest of you are not.
Right.
So that is part and the parcel here. But Clarke comes to Arizona, forms a group of his best black soldiers from several troops, not just his own Troop K, but handpicks his Indian scouts to go along. And it's a volatile coalition. These Indians, the Apaches with them, don't necessarily love the black guys. And one of the guys who's not an Apache is a Yavapai, who is as different as a Romanian is from a Frenchman.
Right.
But they're in this cohesive group that's a forerunner of the Delta Force. And these guys can go anywhere and do anything and get intel from the people on the res, and they can work their way in. They know the territory. They know the language, they know the culture. And this young officer who does terribly at West Point academically and everything else knows that you trust the guys you're with. And he saves one of these black guys. Here's a grandson of a slave owner. And that's actually the son also was a slave owner. And he saves a guy in a firefight just south of Tucson in Mexico, and literally writes home a letter to his mom on letterhead that he grabs from the local railroad station, the Ferrocarril de Sonora, and says, oh, yeah, the boats were whizzing past me and almost got killed. Not the letter you should be writing to your mom at home, okay? Maybe dad, to show how butch you are. But he does. He almost gets killed saving this guy who's wounded, who loses his leg, and goes back to Fort Huachuca, where they take him to the post hospital. And the guy he's literally bleeding to death, and he's in pain. And they ask him, are you okay? I've seen worse. I've seen guys have worse than this. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. An old tough, NCO who ends up going off and leading a life on some small pension back east as he marries and has a family and moves on. Some of these guys become lifers. There's one of the first sergeant who is with Clarke of Troop K, has been this first sergeant forever at the top. He introduces this guy by the name of Frederic Remington, essentially a dropout from Yale. Actually, he kind of goes to school there, but he comes out because he squandered his father's fortune after his dad leaves him half of his estate and has to do something, and has a new wife. And the wife kind of says, yeah, go, Fred, and do something and come back and let me know when you got some, money in your jeans. And he meets this guy, and Fred is more of a racist from New York than this Louisiana kid raised in the deep South, and uses the N-word and everything. By the time he's through, he writes the first time we see in a national, largely distributed publication of the time, Scout with the Buffalo Soldiers. And that's where the term begins to be popularized. It's used, decades before that. But the soldiers themselves never really used it that we know of. Probably they never used it. But having said that, he helps for a while bring these black soldiers in Army blue uniforms to a vast reading public in the East and in Europe and elsewhere. But they're kind of lost in the shuffle. Hollywood ignores them. The only guy who actually pays any attention in the industry, of the entertainment industry, is the first mega superstar creator. That was Buffalo Bill Cody. He has black veterans in his show, but he has American Indians in his show. He has Sitting Bull in his show, and he takes these people to Europe. He exposes the real West, the real frontier, with a large, degree of fantasy, of course, because he's making money. He's selling show business. He's selling tickets. Yeah. It's not show art. It's show business. Right. You're right, but that gets lost for generations until the civil rights movement begins to have guys looking at their own past. And ironically, some of the first scholars who look at the black soldiers are white guys. Yeah. There are very few African American scholars. Even today, when you go to a national park, 20 of which have some theme to have to do with the black soldier in the post-Civil War era, there's only essentially one ranger who interprets them who's African American. So we have a long way to go. Doesn't mean that you can't interpret, as long as you have empathy and knowledge and are willing to step up and tell what is the truth as best as we know it, that you can't do as equally as good a job. But yes, we still have a great deal to go, because you can go to an average high school today, even after all this publicity, is all these books I can show you at if we were at my office, I have racks and racks and racks of the good, bad, and the ugly books about the topic. And the average young person probably has never heard of it. There's a new Walter Hill movie being made about buffalo soldiers in New Mexico, even as we speak.
Right.
But except for Woody Strode back in 1960 under John Ford, who I guess killed enough Indians and promoted enough white guys that he thought it was time to do something about the black soldier, for a national audience. You hear very little about them in the popular culture. And so that's where we have to go today. How do we influence young people to understand that the Marley song is great, but there's something beyond Marley's song?
Yeah, exactly where I was going to go with this. Most of us, I'm critical of us when we want to change history. It's like, well, first let's get into the books and understand what's there. And if you can talk about, if you know that buffalo soldiers are even a thing, even from the Bob Marley song, like what can you talk about that? We can talk intelligently about slavery, the average person, for maybe 30 seconds. Slavery is bad. We all agree with that. We have to see that before we even start the conversation. And then we're almost out of things to say. How prevalent was slavery in the late 1800s around the world? Well, it was more common than not. There's still people today in slave markets. And then there's people that are paid basically, they're not slaves because they get paid. They're not chattel, but they get paid nothing to produce products for us that we throw in the trash, right? So we got a lot to learn about slavery and history in general. And it's interesting when we start to put these things together. And I think about my friends who teach history in high school, and I'm like, there must be weeks, months even, that you just have nothing to do. I wish we had some history to teach. Like the plate is full and we can only put so much in. And just because you offer it doesn't mean, again, like I have friends I'm very critical of because they were offered history and we're all able to read. We can buy any of your 20 plus books and we can go through and read those histories and then read another history and another history. There's a great AP class in Malibu, and it's like Zen. It's the people's history, the capital history, and then the overriding history, and you have to compare and contrast. And you're forced to deal with these simultaneous realities. Without a Carnegie, you can't even have people get pissed off at Carnegie because they're in a field somewhere behind a plow trying to survive and everything. It doesn't mean Carnegie didn't have problems, but these things have to balance out. So when you look at something like the Buffalo Soldiers, what was the black condition on these posts? Because the military is and always leads the way in terms of these things. We screw it up, and someone says, I'll be damned, I'm in charge around here. A black NCO who's not just a cook. That's incredible. In the 1800s, and I know that was the case with these guys. These are men leading men in hard situations, in the saddle for days at a time. This is not something where you're worried about race. You're worried about performance.
You're spot on. And you asked the great operative question. All right, it's 1865. 180,000 of us fought. Many of us died, lost limbs, who are black in the Union Navy and Army. We didn't have somebody liberate us because Lincoln one day woke up and wrote a paper because politically it was a good thing for him to do.
Right.
Because Lincoln was a politician first and foremost. And if he could have said, as he said, if I could, win by freeing none of them, some of them, all of them, whatever it takes to preserve the Union. That's obviously paraphrasing, but it's what he was no Martin Luther King. He was no leader of a movement of equality per se. Right. But now you have people recognizing that blacks have, in every war, as we were talking about again, since the American Revolution and even before, have contributed to the nation in battle and in peacetime, and built an economy in the South that would have never been built by the white guys getting off the boat wearing plumes in their hat because they were, decided they better leave because, the Roundheads are going to, kill them along with their king eventually, And so here these people are building on the backs of sweat equity, these chattel people who are enslaved. And now I've got an opportunity, A, to be somebody, B, I've carried a gun, and I've had the authority of being a sergeant. They won't make me an officer, but as you know from your military service, sometimes you're better off without the officers, and sometimes you better have a damn tough NCO that you don't have to like the guy, but you know that he's a leader and knows what he's talking about, or she knows what she's talking about. So having said that, here's an opportunity to make the same amount as a white guy. You come west, you have a uniform, you have 3 squares such as they are, you have a roof over your head, yeah, and you have a dangerous life. But you have a dangerous life if you go back and decide to be a sharecropper and one day cross the street and look at a white woman and you're lynched the next day and they're burning your corpse, while you're hanging from the tree. So, you have things being offered to you. And there's as many reasons why individuals enlisted in the post-Civil War as there probably are today, because like today, it's a volunteer army. No one's drafted you. This is your choice. The recruiter may have not told you the complete truth, sure, unlike today where the recruiters always tell you everything straight up. Yeah, right. But in those days, they'd get the same thing. And it was tough because now you've got the leadership ability, but you've never had the opportunity to exercise it. And guess what? It was also, you couldn't read or write because you would have been punished so severely they could have killed you if they decided, oh, this is an uppity guy and he can read and write. He's a problem. He's gone. And we sell him down the river or do something else to him. And so here are these guys who are illiterate on their first hitch. But by the time they've got service stripes all the way up to here and they got 30 or 35 years in, some of them are much more polished in their ability to communicate. Regrettably, very few left written records, but we do know they can write, they can communicate, they can lead. There are almost 20 Medal of Honor recipients from the so-called Indian Wars through the Spanish-American War in Cuba. Ultimately, they went from field hands who were illiterate, who couldn't do anything, who couldn't virtually without somebody telling them what to do theoretically, rose to be guys who were top-notch professional soldiers. It wasn't a job of work like a guy off the boat who just says, well, I got nothing else to do. I'll try, and as soon as I get west, I'll beat and go over the hill. They ultimately will go from deserting to having the lowest desertion rates in the entire U.S. Army, mostly the highest retention rates in the Army, and finally getting into the officer corps. And one of the first guys there was only 3 black graduates of West Point in the post-Civil War, Charles Young, the most famous, first black acting superintendent of a national park, amongst other extraordinary things. There are black chaplains. There's in your area someday, go up to the San Joaquin Valley and visit Allensworth. It's a black commune, partially in part started by a bunch of NCOs and a black chaplain who they respected. Because this guy wanted to recruit you. He actually went on recruiting duty. You can imagine his chaplain but he's not trying to, get you to take the $13 a month and, the clean shilling type of thing. He wants to get you in, spend 3 or 5 years of your hitch, teach you to read and write, get you a trade, and get you out of there and back into the civilian community, contributing kind of an each one, teach one operation bootstrap long before there's anything formal. So yes, the Army has had its ups and downs, but it has been in many respects the cutting edge, the vanguard of freedom. Not maybe the way we'd like it, but out there at the point, took the point in several cases. It was an experiment to some. Some officers, like George Custer, refused to serve with black soldiers. Right. Was as racist as they can. But again, by young Powhatan Clarke, the guy from Louisiana, serves with them. And essentially at the end, he dies tragically young in an accident. Doesn't want to serve with white guys. Not because he's prejudiced. It's just that they're not as good as his soldiers are.
Right. This is a thing, too. I mean, as a combat guy, I don't care what your sexual orientation is. I don't care what your gender is. What I care is either are you a pro or are you going to shut up and learn to be a pro? And after that, who cares? And that's really what the military is largely about, at least nowadays. And I'm not saying there hasn't been struggle and there hasn't been progress and lack of progress and unequal progress, all that stuff. But when we look at the military and Buffalo Soldiers specifically, we see people volunteering. That's incredible. Serving in the most dangerous capacity on a horseback. I mean, if you could kind of describe how deadly was southern Arizona, New Mexico? How deadly was this area? Because there's people in Benson probably living very normal lives and never experiencing a gunfight or whatever. But you go a couple miles away in Tombstone, and if you don't have a gun with you, anything can happen to you. So how dangerous was this time? And then why did these guys stay? Why was retention so high? I mean, this is dangerous, hard work. Is it the excitement? Is it the deployed bonus? Or the extra $2 a month for being, posted in a desert post or something?
Great series of questions. Basically, retention is as different for each guy as it is today. Some guys are avoiding stuff. One guy says his mom was going to lump him, and so he went to the recruiter. I mean, they're wonderful. And another guy says he's at Hampton, one of the prestigious black universities of the day. He's got 2 years under his belt, and his folks want him to go off and become a minister, and they're going to send him to seminary. And he wants adventure in the West. Yeah. So he comes out for that and becomes the Army sharpshooter of all time. He's got medals. He falls over. He's wearing so many sharpshooters medals. I mean, the guy's incredible. You got guys in between, that are just, they're escaping racism in the South. They want to be somebody and do become somebody. And, a group of trained guys with guns aren't as easy as a guy out picking cotton in the field who one day the Klan decides it's, you're next. I mean, these are guys who become professional soldiers, whether infantry or cavalry, learning, some of them never seen a horse. And all of a sudden, they have to become the horse. Take Uncle Sam owns that horse, and you take care of that before you take care of yourself. That's the infantry doesn't at least have to do that. They can plop down, get out there, wonderful rations, and throw some coffee on and eat some hardtack and some greasy bacon. But there's so many reasons the alternatives aren't great. They really aren't great. Some people make it. There are black, doctors and lawyers, and certainly the black clergy are a mainstay of not only the black community, but contribute so much, as we were talking about the blues and things. Much of our vernacular today, our culture, whether it's the blues or whether it's jazz or whether it's rock and roll, we owe so much to the black church and the black experience, and as you were saying, some of them are educated Creoles who bring certain aspects, and others, the banjo is an instrument out of Africa, but we take it for granted. It's always, it hasn't always been around. So there are people making an inroad, but this is one of the most assured ways of getting some stature, some retirement. You can go to the old soldiers' home. You can have a pension. Some of these guys end up living outside the post and starting a business. They marry into the community. There's a relationship because it is an insular community. You just don't go out and say, that's a nice looking lady, I'm going to ask her for a drink. No, you're going to find yourself even in supposedly more liberal climate strung up or run out of town. So you have to stay within your own. You don't have a lot of opportunity to go elsewhere. And so there is some cross-pollination of culture, but they have tough jobs, as the soldiers in the West often do. And they're down here in Texas, Arizona. They ultimately get sent up to places like Montana, where they go literally from the firing pan into the icebox type of thing. They are facing, not only, you alluded to it, you can go into Tombstone, or I have a classic example in Clarke's memoirs. They go into Wilcox, and a bunch of the cowboys are from Texas. Do you think they're really respectful of blacks? Yeah. They hate anybody in a blue uniform, and if it's a blackface in a blue uniform, guess what? You get a bonus point to kill one of them. Yeah. And it's the word's on the street. These guys are going to take care of some of the Buffalo Soldiers. I won't tell you the rest of the story. You'll have to look it up in my book. But it's something out of a Hollywood Western what happens. And so these guys have, like the World War II soldier, the double V. They are fighting an enemy in the field who might be Mexican bandits, white bandits, rustlers, American Indians, all these situations. But they're also fighting racism. And that's always an undercurrent, and it's the history of this nation.
You talk about the undercurrent and everything. We talked about Lincoln earlier. And if you read Lincoln's speeches, you read words that you're like, that is really uncomfortable. I mean, they're racist words, and it talks about incapacity. But when we put the lens of context over it, we start to understand that being illiterate in the 1800s was pretty, especially by today's standards. Gosh. I mean, it's so different. And so the ability to understand how to get along is I don't know, nascent. I mean, we're trying to figure out how to do it. And again, it's fits and starts, and it doesn't justify bad behavior. But how would you and I act back then? I mean, I've got 2 degrees. You've got a whole mess of degrees. We're educated, but it doesn't absolve you from how you grow up and, who your uncles were and your experience. In Chris's book, Chris Thomas King, and I'm going to talk to him later in the week, he talks about how a lot of the white that came in and started to basically enslave the Creoles by default because they were black. They were uneducated. And it's like, of course, because they were the ones that were like, I'm leaving, I'm going further west, and I'm going to set up this. Maybe I've got some of dad's money, maybe I don't, but you've got a bunch of people. The people who have big degrees and big brains are staying and they're becoming doctors and whatever. And the folks who are more willing to go out and rough it, whether they're black, Chinese, white, whatever it is, whatever their ethnicity, they're going to go further afield, and you're going to have to deal with these things either through survival or through your own ignorance to get to a point where hopefully we're more evolved now. But can you talk about that and give us some sense?
Boy, I'm glad we didn't prepare for this, because you're setting me up for things I think about but never express as well as, at least my books are terrible. I always say my books are remaindered before they come off the press, but that's another story. Having said that, yes, education plays a big role. And my grandparents were less educated, French Canadians who had lived in this country since 1850 and in Canada since the 1620s.
Yeah.
But they spoke French and they didn't go to school. Maybe the educated person was the priest in their parish, but that was it. And, my father barely had an education. He was the oldest son. It was hard times. The Depression hits. These are not educated people. But then my father gets a, all expense paid vacation to the Pacific in World War II as a Seabee and sees a different world and ends up in Tucson, Arizona, rather than in some little French Canadian, community in Illinois. And so the important thing, prejudice only breaks down if you get the opportunity to see something different, and maybe you become the minority. Right. As when you're deploying to the Middle East, all of a sudden you don't look like anybody around you. Right. They all look alike. They all have a commonality, perhaps in language or, religious beliefs or cultural things. But you're the out guy. Right. It's a very useful tool to break things down. It's hard to not see somebody as an individual when you're put in a position like that, where you've got to survive. And so it's one of these things where the black soldiers help in some respects break down prejudice in certain communities. You'll get newspaper articles that'll lambast, the black soldiers are coming and it's going to ruin the neighborhood. And then pretty soon it's just like, hey, payday came and they didn't go out and rape, pillage, and burn like the white soldiers who've been in the same garrison for the last 15 years. No, their only problem is I'm a barkeep, and these guys don't go in and waste their money on vodka liquor. They go into town and buy clothes, and what's this story about?
Yeah.
It's helping the guy down the street with the mercantile story, who literally in Prescott, Arizona, the newspaper said they don't spend money on booze, but they go in and buy dude clothes, and they come out there looking like, oh my God, they could be on a 1930s, Harlem Renaissance movie or something. They like the style. They have a sense of style and purpose and individuality that was denied for generation after generation. Going back to our friend Clarke gets down to Fort Bowie, Arizona, which is a great place. Sometimes when you're out here, we'll go out and take a hike. You have to hike to get in there.
Love to.
Hike to get into they have a way for people who are wheelchair bound, but the rest of us guys have to go through and feel past the stage station where Cochise, was almost killed, and a war breaks out with a guy by the name of Mickey Free, who was a Latinx kid who lived in Arizona, a whole sub-story for another time. And they're down in these places, and here Clarke shows up with some of his guys out, and with his Delta Force guys, and they're coming in to pay the troops off, because the Eagles got to land periodically and restock up. Because I'm an old logistician, so I know you got to have beans and bullets and make this happen. And while he's there, he sees this Chinese guy who's a servant on the post, because the post officers are living pretty good when they're not in the field, and he's never seen a Chinese guy virtually, and he thinks this guy's great, and this guy tells him all the stories, and he buys a photograph of this Chinese guy who doesn't tell us who he is. So fast forward, the book comes out. I run into a buddy of mine who's here in Arizona, works at Fort Huachuca, a wonderful resource, and he shows me this album, and there's the Chinese guy in the album. This album and the photograph still exist, along with other photographs of Clarke and his strike force hanging out. Here's these Apaches, here's these black guys. And as you were saying, you know what? When the push gets to shove, I don't care what you are. Yeah. In a firefight, are you going to, tuck your tail and run? Or are you going to be next to me, putting in the magazine and firing your M16, or in those days, the old Springfield 45, 55, or whatever, the weapon du jour is? Are you going to stick? You're going to back your buddies because they're your brothers once you're in that situation.
It's I just have a zillion questions, and I'm dying to go to Fort Bowie, which is also known as Apache Flats or whatever it is.
Apache Pass is there.
Apache Pass,
Great
yeah.
stories.
Yeah, and it's just this whole time of history that we just kind of brush over. Charles Murray wrote a great book about human accomplishment, and he's like, it was something about like the last 10 years of history, and then he goes back and back and back, and all of a sudden, a thing about 400 years, and there's all these blank spots that we have. And when you think about, like, this is not New York, this is not Boston out here, this is the Old West. And again, like I keep saying Chinese people, these are Chinese people integrating in, and all the different multi-ethnic groups from Mexico and all the different blends of people from there and from New Mexico, where we are here in Arizona, New Mexico area. It's amazing how people all got along, but also kind of didn't get along, in their own way. Are we still sorting out this part of the country, like on who is what and what we are out here?
I think we're sorting out, no matter whether it's this part of the country or if you're in downtown Chicago.
Okay.
We're always going to still be sorting out. What one hopes you don't lose, and going back to your thought about the Chinese people here and stuff, people stay in their own groups. It's not because they're only clannish, although we all tend to be, comfortable. Yeah. It's survival because you're not necessarily safe when you get out of that comfort zone. Right. So there may be neighborhoods that I wouldn't go into that some of my buddies can go into, and vice versa. You don't feel comfortable, and you might not be safe there. So there's self-segregation, but it's forced in many respects. Mm-hmm. We can get out of that. We can't use that as an excuse anymore. Right. Okay? We got to get beyond that, and only by contact are we going to get out of that. And so that's part of the thing. That's why these black soldiers, these Indian Apache scouts, Yavapai scouts, Chinese servant they're all an amalgam, but they're not all running together, and it's not all one just amorphous mass. Everybody's still distinct. Again, it's a mosaic. It's not a melting pot. People aren't lost. Once we do lose that, shame on us. This country is a great country because we are different people. And you were talking about different people. There's a guy who comes here from Germany and says, it's not working out so good for me. It's before the Civil War. I go to Mexico, and I start a rancho, and I have a family, and it's so good. My name is Ronstadt. That's the grandfather of the famous Linda Ronstadt.
Wow.
He's got a ranch down in Mexico. Says, I think it's time to go back up to the United States now. Oldest son, you're in charge here. Have a good time. Yeah. You can be Jews, and now you are going to be the ranch guy, and you're the colonel of the militia. So now we're chasing Apaches. Yeah. So we can't figure out anything because you got a bunch of white guys from West Point and stuff have no idea what it is. We fought the Civil War. No, that's not how you fight Apaches. Yeah. And so we need some help. Well, these Mexican guys might know. Well, how about Colonel Ronstadt? So he rounds up a bunch of his guys, and he joins Clarke and his scouts, and they go out looking for Apaches because he knows what he's looking for and where to look. Yeah. Meanwhile, Dad's come up here, loses a second family because the first wife has died, and oh, by the way, you will all learn to play the music. And he founds his musical group of traditional Mexican music, which a lot of it is polkas in German, as you know. Let's face it. Mariachi is not from Spain. Right. It's a great, incredible music. And we have a mariachi festival here, bar none. You've got to come back for it. But these people are really diverse. They bring their culture. They share their culture. And even Clarke, the Catholic kid, very devout because mother told him he had to be, Clarke is hanging out with the Jewish people in town because they're the most cultured in Tucson. They're the Jewish merchants who have music. They have literature. And so you do have these cross sections, but it takes extraordinary guys to get out of their comfort zone and do things. We all have to do the same thing. And until we do that, I can write as many books as you want, and we can have as many documentaries on, the 40,000 channels that we have available. We're not going to change until we change ourselves.
We tend to look at the world, at least our world, as black and white. And I keep bringing up Chinese folks because I think it's important to understand, like, here is this character, like, they're not Mexicans, they're not Indians, they're not these black guys that get to. Who are the other ethnic groups? And by the way, French Huguenots. I mean, all these different groups, we often take white people. We always take white people and we smash them into one group. And it's like, if you looked at Romanians, we talked about them, completely different than Slavs, who were completely different than Italians, who were completely different than French. If you looked at a mosaic of European people who are all white, including Turks, you would be like, these are all totally different people with totally different ethnicities. And you can't, just like you can't bunch Latin folks together, by the way, not including Italians who are in fact Latin. What groups are we missing that we're not talking about? And how come there's not a Chinese Delta Force? And how come there's not a Japanese Delta Force? And, what are the other groups that we should be accounting for besides the Buffalo Soldiers?
Well, the Buffalo Soldiers are not unique in terms of being the only blacks in the West, but they're the largest oftentimes population-wise. When they go to Montana, they transfer from here to Montana. That's a reward, I guess. Depending on what time of year, I guess it is. But they all of a sudden, it skyrockets how many African Americans or blacks are on, as those days, colors or Negroes are on the rolls of the census or whatever.